Hey guys, today I'm going to do a book review on 4 historical fiction books that all relate to the English monarchy. The reason I'm putting these 4 books together is the fact that they are historical fiction. They all are kind of the same basic subject, and I felt like doing 4 individual reviews would kind of just be the same sort of review, so I'm going to just go quickly and give my basic thoughts on these, whether I like them or dislike them, and if you guys would like them too. So the books are Within the Hollow Crown by Margaret Campbell Barnes, The Boleyn Wife by Brandy Purdy, The Secret History of Elizabeth Tudor, Vampire Slayer, as told by Lucy Weston, and Rival to the Queen by Carolee Erickson. Down here I'm going to have annotations to each of the 4 books, so if you want to skip around at your own pleasure, feel free to do so. Within the Hollow Crown by Margaret Campbell Barnes is historical fiction based off of the reign of King Richard II. Richard never wanted to be king, and his father is a continual shadow in his life. England is in political and class turmoil, and an inexperienced Richard must figure out how to form his own kingship without his uncles trying to control him. Richard II's reign is a bit of a vague area for me. I don't know that much about it, but I know enough to get the general idea of what his reign was like. This book has a bit of a slow start. I found myself often kind of zoning out on occasion, getting a little bored, and it didn't help matters that since I am kind of unfamiliar with Richard II's reign, that I didn't know all of the political figures surrounding him and their deeper influence. It wasn't until the second half of the novel when Richard's first wife, Anne, enters the picture. Anne was such a refreshing addition to the story. There's not many women in this novel to begin with, so Anne is a godsend. Once Anne and Richard kind of meet and the relationship gets going, the novel tremendously picks up, and it's just so entertaining and really well written. I was worried that after the death of Anne that the novel was just going to go downhill after that, but I was happy that the novel still continued that great pace and how well written it was. And then we were introduced to Richard's second wife, Isabel of Valois. Even though I really loved the Anne and Isabel chapters of this novel, and they were incredibly well written, I feel like after Isabel is introduced to the plot, I feel like the plot just goes way too quickly after that, and the rest of Richard's reign is just rapidly went through, and just all those major highlights and details are just kind of skimmed through just like that. And it's almost as if you gotta know the history, or else you're gonna kind of be lost. And it's all just so very sudden, especially in regards to Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes King Henry IV, and he is the one who usurps the throne from Richard. And considering that that is a big deal with Richard II's reign, it's kind of just skimmed over very quickly. You're not given any sort of details about Bolingbroke. He's just kind of thrown in there at the last minute, and there the throne goes. So I do think, just because of this pace, that Margaret Campbell Barnes really kind of wasted a good thing with her narrative, that she didn't kind of slow things down and really embellish facts. Overall, I did really enjoy this book. It had an incredibly rough start. You just kind of have to get through that whole beginning, make it to the introduction of Anne, and then it's smooth sailing after that. If you are already familiar with the reign of Richard II, I do think this is a good book to pick up. I don't think this is necessarily a good book to pick up if you're trying to kind of start learning about Richard II. This book might be a little too overwhelming. The next book is The Boleyn Wife by Brandy Purdy. This book takes place during the reign of 5 of Henry VIII's wives, and it details all of the palace treachery and intrigue that comes with it. This book tells the story of Lady Jane Parker, who is married to George Boleyn, the brother of Henry VIII's infamous second wife, Anne Boleyn. Jane is shy and plain, and she can't match the wit and appeal of her sister-in-law. Jealous of her husband's devotion to his sister, Jane sets out to make the ultimate betrayal. Before I kind of give my full thoughts on this book, I'm going to give a quote, because I think this quote just perfectly summarizes what you're getting when you go into this book. This book is also told in first person, and this quote is from Jane Parker. "I would be remembered alongside them being Anne and George Boleyn. My name a byword for jealousy, treachery, betrayal, and lies. I found my immortality in infamy. I had unjustly become one of the villains in Anne Boleyn's tale, my true innocence blotted out and obscured by bloodstains." Ooh, I love that quote, you guys, and I freaking love this book. If you know anything about the Tudor era, Jane Parker is basically kind of the villain. She is notorious for betraying her husband George and his sister Anne Boleyn. History has not been kind to poor Jane Parker, and she is often associated as being the villain. And she is hardly ever presented as a sympathetic character. What I really liked about Brandy Purdy's telling of history is that she makes Jane Parker a very multi-layered character. She's not one-dimensional. You really get to see all these various different sides of her and what is prompting her jealousy. To some extent, Jane is still vilified. I'm not going to pardon her for her actions. She is still vilified. You are given depth and motivation to why she does the things that she does. Brandy Purdy does a fantastic job of setting up Jane as someone who is very socially awkward compared to Anne Boleyn, who is basically the life of any party. So obviously Anne and Jane, they just do not mesh at all to begin with. They try, but it doesn't really work. And in between both of them is George Boleyn. George, who is devoted to Anne and really can't stand his wife. To George Boleyn, Jane is just a nuisance and he wants her out of his life. And so that's kind of the starting point of why Jane is the way she is, because she feels neglected. As I said in the synopsis of this book goes through the reign of 5 of Henry VIII's wives that Jane serves under, the first being Catherine of Aragon, then Anne Boleyn, followed by Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, and Catherine Howard. The book spends the majority of the time focusing on Jane's relationship with Anne Boleyn and then later with Catherine Howard. You don't see a lot with Jane and Catherine of Aragon, nor do you see a lot with Anne of Cleves and Jane Seymour. Those ladies all have very small minor chapters. I do think the writing of this novel was really good. Sometimes I do think the wording was a bit odd and it felt a little too modern. But overall, I did really enjoy how she told the story. This novel could have easily just turned into a big timeline of historical events, but Brandy Purdy does a fantastic job of kind of fleshing out these characters, fleshing out these important events, and everyone is not just some textbook figure. They really come to life, I think. Obviously, this is historical fiction. Some liberties have to be taken. We don't know every single detail about Jane's involvement with all these various different women. So Brandy Purdy does a great job of filling in some of those gaps and just providing some plausible scenarios. I don't know if this is a spoiler, but I'm just going to say it anyway because this might throw some people off when you get to it. The only far-fetched idea that Brandy Purdy introduced to this book was this idea that Catherine Howard and Anne of Cleves had a lesbian relationship. I did not really buy that. Again, I don't know if that's a spoiler, but I think that's useful information so you don't go into this book shocked. If you have read Philippa Gregory's The Other Boleyn Girl and The Boleyn Inheritance, The Boleyn Wife is pretty much the exact same thing. It's those two books combined. Just the narrative is told through Jane's eyes and we're given some different perspective. But yeah, a really quick read I found, very enjoyable, and a nice historical fiction fix. Next, I have The Secret History of Elizabeth Tudor, Vampire Slayer, as told by Lucy Weston, and this book seeks to tell the untold story of Queen Elizabeth I's reign. On the eve of her coronation, Elizabeth visits the tomb of her mother, Anne Boleyn, and Elizabeth is told of an ancient lineage involving her family where they basically hunt vampires. The king... I feel silly saying this. This is how ridiculous this novel is. The king of the vampires is Mordred, the bastard son of King Arthur. Mordred wants to rule alongside Elizabeth and turn her into a vampire. Elizabeth must fight for the safety of her country, learn to find herself as a newly anointed queen, and fight against her desires for Mordred. Oh, holy fuck, you guys. I knowingly went into this book knowing that it's paranormal historical fiction, that none of this took place. Oh, Jesus. Most books in historical paranormal fiction tend to be very silly and over the top, and you just gotta roll with it. You just gotta take it in and go with it. The thing is, even when I get these sort of books that are like this, I still expect to go into them expecting really good writing, at least passable writing. This book was just a fucking mess. I will admit, the overall plot does sound really intriguing, and that's why I even bothered to pick it up and read. I liked this whole notion that down from Anne Boleyn's side of the family, her mother's side, I suppose, is that her family are all descended down from Morgan le Fay, the sister of King Arthur, and that they're all vampire slayers. How awesome is that? And I was also amused with the fact that Mordred is a vampire. King of the vampires, in fact. It was after the first couple chapters of this book where things just fell apart and I just couldn't take it. Like I said, this book is a big old mess. There is constant talk of hunting and killing vampires, but that never happens. Instead, what we get is Elizabeth Tudor and Robert Dudley are constantly arguing with each other and trying to figure out their relationship. The synopsis of this book makes it sound like Elizabeth and Mordred have this really steamy, hot love affair. But that was absent. There was no such thing. There's just a few chapters of them actually even together, and then he kind of just goes off, and that's it. I don't even think they actually have sex together. And I also didn't like the fact that instead of like using wooden stakes to kill vampires, Elizabeth has like this weird magical energy, this light orby thingy that she kills vampires with, which I thought was so ridiculously stupid. I went into this book wanting to see a really kick-ass Elizabeth Tudor fight vampire forces. The use of Mordred in general was vastly underused. His character just kind of goes nowhere. He should have been interesting. He wasn't. Another thing, if you notice when I introduced this book, I said The Secret History of Elizabeth Tudor Vampire Slayer as told by Lucy Weston. I believe Lucy Weston is just a fake name, a pen name. I think it's supposed to be told from like Lucy Westenra from Bram Stoker's Dracula. Like Lucy after she became a vampire, and she's like someone who writes stories now, if that makes any sense. So the author of this book is a fellow vampire, and they're trying to spread the knowledge of vampirism throughout England. Kind of speaking about historical paranormal fiction, I really love Seth Grahame-Smith's Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. That is just one of my favorite vampire-related books. And the thing is, even though Seth Grahame-Smith throws in Abraham Lincoln and vampires and it all just mashes together, the thing is, it totally works. That book is just so intelligently written, very detailed, and you get all this great historical context, and it just all really works. You can buy it. So that's the big thing. You can buy the fact that Abraham Lincoln was a badass vampire slayer. Instead of wasting money on this book, I suggest you go get Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter because it's so much better. And the last book that I have for you guys is Rival to the Queen by Carolee Erickson, which tells the story of Lettice Knowles, cousin to Elizabeth I. Lettice and Elizabeth fight against each other, not only with their looks and their wit, but also their love of Robert Dudley. Sadly, this book was a disappointment as well. And I don't know why I'm kind of shocked by that. The only other Carolee Erickson book I've read is The Tsarina's Daughter, which was about Tatiana Romanov. And I really didn't like that book either. I just didn't care for the writing. It was kind of slow and boring. And this book was basically the same thing. The synopsis of this book should sound pretty awesome. There's some conflict between cousins, you know, and one of the cousins is Queen Elizabeth I. Plus, you have all this palace intrigue and the conflict between religions, and then Robert Dudley. This book just did not read like narrative fiction. It just read like a timeline of events, and that is something I really hate about historical fiction, is if it is just a timeline of events rather than a proper narrative where characters are really fleshed out. This book starts during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor and then goes all the way up until 1634, so it goes through 50 plus years of material. And there's a lot that happens in those 50 plus years, and it should all be so exciting and thrilling, but it's not. It's just dull and boring. And you know what? Lettice Knowles, she's the protagonist of this novel, and I can't even begin to tell you anything about her because she is just not fleshed out whatsoever. And I really got annoyed with how Elizabeth I was portrayed in this novel. She's just really shrewd and bitchy and grumpy and paranoid. When I often think of Elizabeth I, I think of this woman who's very fearless and brave, and that just didn't come across in this book at all. And the synopsis of this book also makes it sound like there's this really great love triangle between Elizabeth, Lettice, and Robert, and that's just kind of non-existent as well. People need to learn to write synopsises better. So yeah, a massive disappointment of a book that I was looking forward to, uninteresting characters, dull story that just read like a timeline of events. So yeah, don't pick up this book, pick up some Philip Gregory or some Alison Weir instead. So that's it for these 4 historical fiction book reviews. I hope you guys enjoyed. Have you guys read any of these? Do you intend on picking up any of these? Did you like the format of this video with me talking about multiple books? Just let me know in the comments below. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you liked this book review, you may like these other book reviews. Bye guys.